Hello, good day guys. Now for today's video lecture, I'll be discussing all about historical sources. So let's get it started. So here are the learning objectives for this lesson. So first we have to define historiography. Second, provide examples of primary and secondary sources. Third, compare and contrast the kinds and types of historical sources. And lastly, evaluate historical sources. Now first things first, we have to define what is historiography. So when we talk about historiography, this is a type of discipline or science na kailangan natin sa subject na ito. So defining historiography, it's basically the study of historical writing. When we attempt to analyze or interpret historical texts or documents, ang tawag natin dyan ay historiography. Now, we will be analyzing documents, writings, texts sa subjects na ito, no? So we don't just expect or yung assumption natin na we will just memorize about dates, it's too elementary. So medyo higher level na yung gagamitin natin dito sa readings in Philippine history. So more likely we will be focusing on analysis and interpretation of text. When speaking about text, ang object of analysis natin would now be sources. So we have a term which is now historical sources. Now, to define sources, sources are artifacts that have been left by the past. So for instance, yung spoon ng nanay mo could be considered to be a source. Or yung spoon ng nanay mo noong kabataan could be considered to be a source. Or yung mga vintage car ng ating mga lolo at lola. So basically, they are considered to be sources. Or in a formal example would be old books. Books around 16th century. Yung mga jars during your prehistoric Philippines. Then yung mga fossils could be considered to be sources. Or your treasures actually. Now, there's a specific type of source called artifacts. So when we talk about artifacts, please take note that artifacts are created by humans, usually for practical purposes. Now, the difference between source and artifacts, source medyo general siya, while artifacts medyo specific siya. All artifacts are considered to be sources, but not all sources are considered to be artifacts. Now, to give an example would be fossils. So dinosaur fossils. So dinosaur fossils could be considered to be a source. However, hindi siya pwede maging artifact kasi hindi naman siya ginamit for human purpose or hindi siya ginamit for practical purpose. Yung fossil, pwede siya maging artifact pag ginawa na siyang tool ng tao. So, ganun yung definition natin ng artifacts, no? Okay. So, I hope medyo nagets na natin yung difference between source and artifacts. So, artifacts, gawa yan ng tao and may certain purpose yan. And sources is generally gawa siya sa past. Now, let's go to the types of sources. So, we have two types, primary and secondary sources. Now, please take note of these two terms kasi ito yung mahalaga sa readings in Philippine history. So, to define primary source is also known to be original source or evidence. So, fresh siya. Ito yung hinahanap ng mga historian. Ito yung pinaka-fresh. When we talk about primary source, please take note of the term original and first-hand. So basically, these are sources na that we wanted. So basically, ito yung mga source na document doon sa time na gusto nating i-analyze. We will further understand primary source and secondary source mamaya sa mga example ko, no? So definition muna tayo. And when we talk about secondary source, so it is built upon primary source. Please take note, build upon primary source. So basically sa Tagalog, pwede natin siyang tawagin as chismis. And probably may possible distortion siya. So tandaan natin na primary source, original, secondary source, build upon primary or original sources. Now, to give an example natin would now be the experiences of World War II veterans. So mahilig yung mga lolo at lola natin na magkwento tungkol sa buhay nila nung panahon ng Hapon. So we have a diagram dito. And more likely, we look into the stories. Pag yung kwento ng mga veterans ay mismong nanggaling sa kanila or directed sa kanila, it is considered to be primary source because they experience yung nangyari nung panahon nila. So, primary source yan. So, paano natin siya makukuha? Through direct narrations from the veterans, or they recorded their experiences through diaries or published it through novels. Now, instances, kinikwento ng mga veterans sa kanilang mga anak, which basically are the Generation X, yung mga magulang natin. Now, yung magulang natin, pag kwento nila yung kwento ng kanilang magulang, yung mga veterans sa atin, which is the millennials, it now becomes secondary sources. Kasi, hindi na siya galing dun sa mismong original. So secondary sources, pwedeng narration ng ibang tao, not the exact tao na gusto nating malaman. And they could now create documentaries, or example of secondary sources would now be documentaries or translation of written text. So hindi na siya legit. So ano na siya, nagalaw na for instance. Okay, now to further understand more about primary and secondary sources, we look into one book in the Bible, which is the book of Genesis. However, may question mark yan, no? Kasi a lot of scholars debated, and it has already been debunked by the Vatican that the book of Genesis is a creation myth. So hindi siya ganun ka-historically accurate. However, for the sake of distinguishing primary and secondary sources, gagamitin natin siya, no? And the assumed author was Moses. Principally in theology, ang author daw ng Genesis ay si Moses. Okay, now looking into the timeline on the book of Genesis, ito yung timeline, no? So, kwento yung creation story, Adam and Eve, from Noah, from the Tower of Babel, tapos yung Abraham genealogy, sina Isaac, then coming to life of Moses. Now, assuming that the author is Moses, so lahat ng narration from Egypt up to Exodus, kung kailan nag-exist si Moses, is considered to be primary. Bakit? Kasi Moses actually lived during those times of event. Now, yung kwento from creation up to Abraham genealogy is considered to be secondary sources. Now, tendency, narinig lang ni Moses or napasa-pasa, yung mga kwento napasa-pasa kay Moses, and it now considered to be secondary sources. Kasi wala si Moses nung time ng creation. Wala si Moses nung time ni Noah or yung nung time ni Abraham. So, nagiging secondary source siya. Then, a third example would now be yung kay Jose Rizal. So, Jose Rizal wrote a lot of documents. So, he wrote a diary nung kabataan niya, essays, novels, then news articles dun sa La Liga Filipina. Now, itong mga to is considered to be primary source when we attempt to document or analyze the life of Jose Rizal. So, primary source siya. Now, dahil si Rizal medyo naging historical figure siya, madaming gustong mag-aral tungkol kay Rizal to know his life and writings. So, the academe or scholars or historians created books about Rizal. Now, itong books about Rizal, nakarely dun sa mismong sulat niya. So, technically, secondary source siya. So, I hope medyo na-distinguish na natin yung primary source and secondary source. Now, moving forward, we have the kinds of sources. So, there are two kinds wherein we have remains and testimonies. Now, unahin natin yung remains and unahin natin yung remains. So, remains could be classified as well or termed as relics. So, relics, tandaan natin guys, relics objects to, no? So, tangible objects, tangible artifacts. Now, unahan ko na kayo when it comes to testimonies. Ang testimonies kasi it could be tangible or intangible. So, ito more likely objects siya, no? And please take note, relics are the dominant objects that are being analyzed by archaeologists. No, so when we talk about archaeology, if you know Indiana Jones, I hope you watch Indiana Jones for those who like controversies and action movies. So si Indiana Jones para siyang treasure hunter. However, treasure hunting and archaeology may similarities. They look for material remains from the past, yung mga artifacts. However, the difference between a treasure hunter and an archaeologist, a treasure hunter is somehow looting, hinahanap niya for monetary value. On the other hand, an archaeology basically looks into the value of the relic. So, talking about relic, ano yung origin, ano yung purpose ng remain na na-discover niya. Now, to give an example all about relics and remain, we have human fossils in the Philippines. So, ang gusto nating ma-analyze would be prehistoric Philippines. Now, lately, nag-bloom yung Philippine archaeology because of certain findings dito sa Pilipinas. And it could alter Philippine history. Why? Kasi yung dominant approach or yung dominant theory when it comes to prehistoric Philippines is yung theory on migration. If you have an idea all about that theory on migration, pinopose siya ni Oatley Bayer. So, yung sinasabi ni Oatley Bayer basically is yung ancestors natin were migrants. So, speaking about migrants, may tatlong waves yan. Yung Negrito, Indones, then Malays. At yun yung naging dominant approach dun sa AP textbooks natin nung elementary. However, looking into these discoveries, it could alter the theory on migration. And it could alter Philippine history. Paano? To give you a timeline muna. Sorry, sinisipon. To give you a timeline muna. Okay. The first famous discovery was around the year 1999. So, on the Tabon Cave, they have discovered the Tabon Man. So, ito yung mukha ng Tabon Man. So, cranium siya, part of a skull, then some jaw. Then, when they carbon dated it, lumalabas na around 24,000 years nag-exist yung Tabon Man. So, technically, ang gustong sabihin is that medyo nade-debunk na yung theory of migration. And that could now support yung land bridge theory na dati Philippines has a connection to mainland Asia. Now, a further discovery was around 2003, no? So, sa Calao Cave, nahanap naman nila si Calao Man. And when they carbon dated Calao Man, lumalabas na around 67,000 years nag-exist si Calao Man. And around 2018, forensic archaeologists or simply scientists discovered or declared that the Calao Man fossil is a new human species and they have named it as Homo luzonensis. So ito yung fossils na nakita nila noon, no? So these are parts of the phalanges. In science or in biology, phalanges are basically yung bones natin sa feet and your hands. So yan yung nahanap sa Calao Cave. And a recent discovery around 2017 sa Rizal, Kalinga, they have now discovered some rhino fossils. Now, when they carbon dated those rhino fossils, lumalabas na around 709,000 years nag-exist yung rhino. So, ito yung actual picture ng rhino, no? So, this is a femur bone. Now, anong kinalaman niya sa prehistoric Philippines? And especially when we are talking about human fossil. Hindi naman yan human fossil. And more likely, hindi siya dapat under history. Although it's still part of history, pero it's more on towards biology or paleontology to be exact. Now, yung mga forensics and archaeology, forensic archaeologists by the way, when they analyze the fossil, nakita nila na may cracks. So I hope nakikita niyo yung mouse ko. So nakita nila may cracks yan, no? Now, looking into the cracks and inside the cracks, parang may scrape yan na they want to get the bone marrow. So may assumptions sila na yung cause of death ng rhino would now be because it was hunt. It is used for eating, kinain siya, no? Pero assuming looking into the cracks, hindi siya pwede gawin to ng any animals kasi may force na ginawa in order to create those cracks and extract the bone marrow. So too much force, hindi siya kaya ng any animal. Mapa saber tiger, for instance, I do not know. However, ang one speculation, and it's a very high speculation, hypothesis rather, is that ang cause ng crack would now be because of tools. And the only creature na gumagamit ng tools would now be the human creature. So when we correlate it, pag pinagsabay-sabay natin yan, the cause of death of the rhino is because of a human person. And look into the existence, 709,000 years. So there's a possibility na may mga tao na dito sa Pilipinas around 709,000 years. And if that is well proven, automatically it could change now yung it could now change yung notion natin all about Philippine history. So hindi na tayo migrants, but during those time, talagang nakatira na talaga dito yung mga ninuno natin. So that is relic. Now, second would now be in terms of testimonies. Sinisip ko na. So in terms of testimonies. So yung difference niya lang naman when it comes to relics or remains, testimonies could be tangible or intangible. Why? Because these are oral or written reports. So looking into relics or remains, walang possible or accurate message. Unlike with testimonies may message na gustong i-deliver. So example would now be speeches of iconic figures, presidente natin, yung mga bayani natin, or even diaries from your parents. Yan, could be considered to be testimonies. Then we have Cordillera chants. So yan, Cordillera chants, intangible yan kasi ang gagaling ng mga elders natin. So the elders basically memorize all the Cordilleran chants, yung mga epic chants natin, no? So for instance, we have the Hudhud ni Aliguyon. So this is an Ifugao chant. So Aliguyon is an Ifugao warrior. So naka-narrate yung buhay ni Aliguyon. So yun yung mga testimonies natin. Now, there's another type of classification called purpose of sources. So basically, there are two purposes of sources. We have intentional, then unintentional. So looking into the terms, medyo may similarity siya, no? Medyo obvious actually. So when we talk about intentional sources, so intended siya to document history. So intended siya to document history. While unintentional, basically wala sa intention nila that they will be documenting history or the lives of another person. However, latently may message dun that would now tell us about the event during those time. Now, to further understand these two, may provide some examples. So sa intentional, for instance, we have the film of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. So yung film, nagka-capture ng camera nun, may intention siya na i-document yung buhay ni John F. Kennedy. So that is intentional. Or we have biographies, yung mga novels natin or diaries. So si Juan Ponce Enrile, so the immortal guy. So more likely intentional kasi gusto niya i-document yung buhay niya, experience, yung kanyang history. While on the other hand, when we talk about unintentional, for instance, we have memoirs of Japanese soldiers in Iwo Jima. Ano ibig sabihin nito, no? Ano yung intention talaga nung memoirs of Japanese soldiers or letters from Iwo Jima? Sorry, this should be letters from Iwo Jima. So yung memoirs na yun or yung letters na yun actually serves like a communication. So they want to communicate their family in mainland Japan. However, nagiging piece na siya ng history kasi when they covered it up, nakita na din nila yung experiences or yung buhay ng mga sundalo nung World War II. So yung original intention ng memoirs of Japanese soldiers in Iwo Jima is basically for communication and not for history. And similar dun sa second example, screenshots of an FB conversation. So ang main intention naman is for the sake of communication. However, those screenshots would now become history in the sense na kunyari you are magshota yung dalawa tapos nahuli ng babae na nangliligaw siguro yung lalaki sa ibang babae. So naging historical yung kanilang relation. Okay. So basically number 2, it's more likely communication pero it now becomes a historical piece or source. Now moving forward, we have typology. So this is another classification, so medyo madaming terminologies, no? So we have written, unwritten, then technological innovation. So tatlo yan, no? So under written, by the way, upang magets natin, no? So written, may tatlong classification yan. Unwritten, may dalawa. Then technological innovation, around 5. So when we talk about written, nakasulat siya. Yan yung naging natin tandaan. Then already to present the first two, we have narrative and we have diplomatic sources. Now, key terms na lang tayo, no? So, when we talk about narrative or literary, nakasulat siya in narrative form, obviously. However, they want to deliver a certain message. Now, those certain message is in the form of ego documents. So, nandyan yung perception, yung I document. So, you're documenting about an individual, for instance, yan ay narrative. Now, remember that yan agad yung unang papasok. So, for instance, scientific tracts, news articles, diaries, novels, or film, then your biography. Biography, novel, kasi may tao dun, may perception ng author or a certain person. So, yun yung narrative, no? Okay. Now, second, so going back dun sa una muna, no? Narrative, tanda natin, narrative form. From its term, narrative, no? Then the second would now be in terms of diplomatic sources. When we talk about diplomatic sources, key terms tayo dun, diplomatic sources are considered to be the legitimate sources. So they are legit, they're authoritative, they are authentic, or in historians, they stated it that diplomatic sources are the best sources. Now, paano natin malalaman yung difference between narrative and diplomatic? Narrative, everybody could just narrate a story. Pagdating sa diplomatic sources, diplomatic may authentication yan. It's a legal document. So may authentication, may signature, may stamp, may seal, and that is a diplomatic source. Paano ko nasabi yan? Let's look into the parts of a diplomatic source. So more likely, imagine a legal paper or a formal paper, may tatlong parts yan. Protocol is basically the introduction. When we go to the content, yan yung body. At yung closing, that is now the essential part of your diplomatic source. Nandyan na nakalagay yung mga authenticating formulas. An example of your authenticating formulas would now be a signature. Probably coming from an authoritative position, president, or a lawyer. Tapos aside from signature, may seal, may stamp. What else? Yun, basically ganun, no? May authenticity. So yun yung diplomatic source. Now, the third type of written source will now be social documents. So social documents, gawa siya ng institutions. So for instance, will now be government institutions, churches, and schools. Now, anong kinalaman niya, anong pinagkaiba niya sa diplomatic sources? Now, social documents don't have authentication. Wala siyang seal, wala siyang signature. Although there's a signature, hindi naman ganun ka authoritative, hindi naman siya ganun ka governing part ng government, etc. So, ganun lang yung social documents, no? So, again, difference between diplomatic source and social documents. Social documents walang authentication, while diplomatic source may authentication. Now, the second source typology will now be unwritten sources or documents. So, medyo similar siya dun sa kinds. Paano ko nasabi? Tandaan natin ulit yung relic versus testimonies. Okay. Archaeological evidence, very similar siya actually when it comes to relic and remains. So, ulitin ko, may na-discover kang jewelry, gold, kabaon, kotse na nakahukay sa iyong bahay, kutsarang gawa sa silver, etc. Those are considered to be archaeological evidences. While oral evidences, tandaan natin, very similar siya sa testimonies. So, interview, pwede siya. Or for instance, speech, or yung chants natin, no? So, quite similar siya sa types actually, sa relics and remains. Then, third, among the source typology would now be it will now be technological innovation. So, when we talk about technological innovation, so gamit na natin yung modern technologies from your photography and film, sound recordings, radio, television, computer, and presently your internet. So these are now source when it comes to history. And lastly, we have evaluating sources. So this is now one of the main parts of readings in Philippine history because we are attempting to analyze and critique and in the same time interpret historical sources. So there are two types, external and internal criticism. I-flash ko na lahat. Ayan. So, our task in readings in Philippine history is to critique, analyze yung mga sources natin. So, we have external criticism or we have this term called context analysis. This is a common term, context analysis. Then we have internal criticism wherein it is also called as content analysis. Now, when we talk about external criticism, guys, yung question natin dyan, is it authentic, genuine, or is it legit? Now, may na-discover ka kunyaring book or scrolls or letter, kunyari, 16th century, nakadate siya na 16th century. Ang una nating aalamin as historians, legit nga ba to? Authentic, hindi ba siya peke? Just like your shoes, di ba? Pag bibili ka ng sapatos, titignan mo muna kung original siya, kung legit, kung class A, class B. Yun yung external criticism. Kaya for instance, you as a treasure hunter, may nakita kang sabihin na natin na gold, tapos may nakaukit na Jose Rizal for instance, legit kaya ito? So if you know the show Pawn Stars ng History Channel, yan yung ginagamit nila, external criticism. Now kung nalaman mo na legit, na authentic, na genuine yung isang gamit, you will now go to the next, which is now internal criticism or content analysis. Now, for instance, when it comes kunyari sa gold, yung inscription, so titignan mo ngayon, para saan ito? Or when it comes to letter, simply, when it comes to letter, for instance, titignan mo ngayon, what does it say? What does it mean? What does it talk about? So, yun yung titignan natin sa internal criticism. Now, for instance, may nakita kang letter, pag external, totoo nga ba to na sinulat ni Emilio Aguinaldo? Pag nalaman mo na totoo, chinek mo yung signature, lahat ng grammar niya for instance, pati yung handwriting niya, tumutugma doon sa sulat ni Emilio Aguinaldo. Let's now go to the second criticism, which is now internal or content analysis. Aalamin mo ngayon ano yung gustong sabihin ni Emilio Aguinaldo. So I hope medyo na-gets natin yung external and internal criticism. Pag medyo hindi na-gets, we have the modules, so please read on them, but I hope medyo nakatulong ako ng kahit unti. So thank you. Once again, then God bless, then always take care. Always take care.